Hello, everyone, and welcome to your virtual reunion. I'm Lauren Watchkin, Director of Alumni Experience here in OER, and I'm so happy to be with you here today. For today's session, we will be collecting questions for the Q&A, which we'll distribute throughout the session. So please use the Q&A feature in Zoom to submit a question at any time throughout the presentation. And if you submitted any questions when you registered, we have those as well. Today, we are so pleased to have Professor Simon Johnson joining us for an exclusive Dean Circle virtual reunion session. Simon, we'd love it if you'd join us on screen. On behalf of the Office of External Relations, I want to take this opportunity to thank each one of you for your leadership support as Dean Circle donors to the MIT Sloan Annual Fund. The Dean Circle is a community of the school's most dedicated and loyal supporters. This year, each of you chose to sustain and protect MIT Sloan by making a gift in celebration of your milestone reunion. Because of your generosity, we are able to support the continuous and changing needs of our community. Your support also provides us with the flexibility to take on new opportunities that will improve the school and the world, just as Professor Johnson is doing with his COVID-19 research. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Simon Johnson, who is the Ronald A. Kurtz Professor of Entrepreneurship. Simon is also head of Global Economics and Management Group and chair of the Sloan Fellows MBA Program Committee. He co-founded and currently leads the popular Global Entrepreneurship Lab course as well. Professor Johnson has been at the forefront here at MIT since the start of the COVID-19 crisis. As part of the COVID-19 Policy Alliance, led by MIT Sloan faculty members, he is actively involved in multiple projects to develop pandemic-related data tools and programs. We are so glad to have you joining us here and presenting as part of our webinar series for Virtual Reunion. And Simon, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Lauren. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. I'll speak for about 15 minutes, then we'll have some Q&A. And after a fair amount of time on that, I'll come back and try to put a little bit of a package and a forward-looking message with you for the conclusion that will be intentionally upbeat, because I think we have to talk about the entire picture. We're going to have to talk about some aspects of what we've happened and what we've all seen, which are frankly disappointing and somewhat upsetting. But I think we can I do really think that we, all of us at MIT and you yourselves in your personal professional lives can get to better solutions. So that's where I'm heading over the next hour, to really try and dig into that with you. Now, the topic of this talk is surviving the second wave. And I don't mean this in a theoretical or abstract or wishful thinking way. I mean, what are the actions that we need to take, that I need to take, people I work with need to take, and that you may want to consider taking in order to survive whatever is coming at us from this coronavirus. And that's going to involve, for sure, some kind of second wave. We don't know when, we don't know where. We can talk about exactly what our best estimates at this point would be. But I think that this is now a stage when we need to derive some lessons learned from the past 2.5 months and think about what we can do differently going forward. So let me, to get to that, let me just give you a little bit of my backstory over the past 2.5 months. Now, I think as many of you know, my background is in economics, and I've worked in major economic, financial crises, systemic crises, very big crises around the world over 35 years. I worked through the fall of communism in multiple countries. I worked in the Asian financial crisis. I was the chief economist of the International Monetary Fund in 2007, 2008. And I was very engaged have been very engaged in US policy at the federal level subsequent to that, across working with Republicans and Democrats, actually. But on March 10th of this year, it dawned on me after a number of other conversations with colleagues that COVID-19 was going to be potentially devastating to the United States and to the world. And I did what I think any smart MIT person would do under the circumstances, which is I called a friend. Actually, I called Retsev Levy, who is an operations management expert at MIT, who was not at that point particularly my friend, but I knew him and I knew he was a very smart guy. And I said to him, Retsev, this problem is coming, what should we do about it? And we, from that conversation, we created the COVID-19 Policy Alliance, and we started to formulate policy ideas, proposals that we could put to the federal government in the first instance. We did that after 3 or 4 days of working, along with some private sector partners. And then we went to work with the state government, and then we started to make some proposals to large, let's say, private foundations, very prominent foundations, about things that they could do to improve the situation. And I'm very proud of that work. I think it was timely. I think we were pretty much on target, given what we knew then. And I have to say to you right now, very, very clearly and plainly, it didn't work. We suggested we had very good ideas what other people could do, and they didn't want to listen to us. I mean, why they didn't want to listen, fascinating question, no doubt. We can talk about that for years and years to come. But within a week, we realized, or maybe 10 days, that if something was going to happen, we would have to do it ourselves. And I've worked in a lot of crises, as I said, and I think in every crisis, you want to find people around whom you can rally. You want to sort of, if the federal government says no, if the state government can't get there, keep on going down until you find people who have a position, who have problems to be solved, people whom you can help. And so we worked that very hard and rallied in the end, after a number of twists and turns, we rallied around Tara Gregorio, who's the president of the Massachusetts Senior Care Association. So her association includes almost all the nursing homes and many of the assisted living facilities in Massachusetts. And Tara is a fantastic person, and you know, we've had a great relationship with her, and we will do many things for her, I think, for a long time to come. But I have to tell you, in that first conversation, when I reached her at 9 o'clock one evening, through various connections, and I thought we knew quite a lot. I thought we'd established our credibility. I thought we knew what we were doing, and I said to Tara, anything you need, Tara, just let me know, and we'll provide that for you to the best of our abilities. And Tara said, Simon, what I need more than anything else is testing. And my reaction was, oh my goodness, I don't know how to get her testing. So I asked Retsev, and Retsev said, call the Broad Institute and let's find out, because we'd seen press reports that they had PCR testing, that's the virus testing, and let's see if we can get that for the nursing homes of Massachusetts. And thank you now and always to the people who built that capacity at the Broad, including some Sloan graduates, I would emphasize, but a lot of other extremely brilliant scientists associated with Broad, with MIT, and with Harvard, because they helped us and they helped the nursing homes. And that, my friends, is when we began to turn the corner, because when we could bring testing, we understood the other things that needed to be done. For example, bringing better personal protective equipment, not just into the country, which we'd already been doing, but into the nursing homes, as well as stronger infection control. So people and policies that can help prevent outbreaks or stop outbreaks in their track, workforce strengthening, and so on. And I would like to emphasize the critical contributions throughout this part of the process are made by Kate Kellogg, my colleague in organizational studies. So Retsev is a data guy. You talk numbers with data, with Retsev, you talk models. Kate is a qualitative researcher who spends a lot of time with people, understanding how their organizations work, understanding how decisions are made. And she's been embedded with Mass Senior Care Association for, I think, going on 2 months now, where she's involved every day in helping Tara and the colleagues think through, okay, what do we know? What do we need to do? How do we manage this piece of our relationship internally or with the outside world, and so on? Kate has done an absolutely outstanding job. And I would also want to emphasize that we've had many, many other members of the MIT community, including a lot of current students and other faculty, mostly in that phase from Sloan. I'll come on to the rest of the campus in a moment. But I definitely want to be sure to mention Yasheng Huang, who helped us unlock how to work with China on PPE resupply. Valerie Karplus, who you might have seen actually written up in the Washington Post, her role in helping explain to the White House how to bring more PPE effectively into the US. What happened with that PPE subsequently, I understand, is a matter of some controversy, but Valerie handed them the keys to the car. Okay, how they drive the car is a little bit out of our control. So that was an amazing contribution. Tom Cochen helped us with a lot of workforce issues. Paul Osterman was fantastically helpful on training. Vivek Farias, Vivek has built, Vivek is also in operations research and operation management. Vivek has built many brilliant pieces of software in his life, and will do a lot more, I'm sure. But I doubt he will have as much impact on as many people as with the software he built in New Hampshire and other places that enables nursing homes to keep the authorities informed of their true status and ask them to be resupplied in various urgent ways. So there's a lot of people backing up that system, but they're people who are empowered by Vivek software. And you know, there's some really nice words in the entryway or near the cafeteria in Sloan about principled leaders and our role in the world and so on. And I've always believed in those words, and I've always thought that's what we are. I have to tell you, I've never seen them in operation as intensely in and around Sloan as I have over the past 2 months. And we helped, working with a lot of people. It's always a team effort, of course, but we helped the state understand the issues. We helped bring it back to them in a way they could understand. Always the one-page policy memo. Some of you who've taken my classes know this part of my life. The one-page crisp policy memo that states very clearly what can be done and how it can be done and why this is compelling. You know, that helped unlock $130 million of additional funding from the state for nursing homes, which is we're still discussing the right strategy, as in how to use those resources, whether there are enough resources, whether they're being applied in the right way and so on. But still, thanks to my amazing colleagues and Tara Gregorio and her fantastic people at the Mass Senior Care Association and the people who run some of the leading nursing homes in Massachusetts, including also Sloan alums. So Adam Berman, I'm talking to you. This is just been an amazing group achievement. But it's not enough. Dramatic Zoom pause. It's not enough because obviously what we want to do is end this crisis, right? You know, in the first part of the crisis, we tried to understand what was going on and tried to get to the core of the issues. In the second part of the crisis, we found people around whom to rally and to make a stand and to make a difference. And we've done both of those. But now we want to end it. And the way you end any problem like this is by going big, by going very big. And I think it's also by really taking those same principles that we brought to phase 1 and phase 2 to everything across the COVID-19 problem stack, particularly, and I emphasize this again and again to people, particularly focused on nursing homes. Why the continued obsession with nursing homes? It's very simple. Let's look at the data. Population of Massachusetts is 7 million people. 38,000 people live in nursing homes on average. Obviously, population goes up and down in that sector. 60% of all the deaths from COVID-19 in Massachusetts during this time period have happened in nursing homes among those 38,000 people. Now, it's not 100% of the problem, but it's a huge part of the problem, and it's a problem we know what's involved in it, and we know it's a complex stack of issues. And my proposal, well, the way I'm organizing my life is to try and work every single one of those problems with as many allies and as many resources, as many smart people as I can. And so where do I find such smart people? Where would I possibly be able to mobilize the resources to tackle something that's, you know, one of the largest problems in the history of the country, let alone the world? Well, I think that's pretty obvious. I think to anyone who's listening to me speak right now, you look around MIT, you find very smart people at MIT. Masks. What kind of masks should we be using? What kind of mask policy is actually going to work? How do we get compliance with masks? What do we know about masks? Do you know, by the way, who did the scientific work that underlies this so-called 6-foot rule? You must stay back 6 feet or 2 meters if you prefer from everyone. No, I didn't think you did, because it doesn't exist. That's a heuristic kind of, okay, this is how respiratory diseases work, we think, coming from epidemiology. It's not a crazy number to start with, but it's certainly not enough. So the Associate Dean of Engineering, Pekka Hosoi, has done some amazing work on the literature, testing masks, and she has published just last night, we'll send around the link, her thinking and our thinking on masks, which is for discussion, and it's for assessment. With the key point being that while N95 masks, as you all know, are extremely effective if and only if properly fitted, they will not be available to the general population anytime soon, I don't believe, given the global supply situation. So Pekka has identified the kind of cloth mask that, if properly fitted, again, can protect you and other people around you almost as effectively as an N95. And if you don't believe me, go look at Pekka's math, because of course there's math, right? And one of the best experiences I've had intellectually, you know, ever, let alone in this crisis, was when Ron Rivest. Ron is a genius of cryptography and institute professor and also a budding expert on masks. When Ron and Pecco started arguing and deliberating, but in an animated fashion, the pros and cons of various ways of measuring Mars properties, I was just sitting in the front row with my popcorn. I think you all have popcorn right now. It's exactly the same thing. I had my popcorn out and I'm thinking, this is great. I let these guys go at it for a while and then we'll write the one-page memo. The one-page memo for governments, the one-page memo for private companies, the one-page memo for university campuses, because of course we all need to reopen, and I believe we are going to reopen, but we need to do it safely in an appropriate manner. So I work around, I look around MIT, I find experts, we put these together, and I also look at what we don't have at MIT. I mean, to the best of my knowledge, there's no card-carrying expert in the epidemiology of infectious diseases. I mean, I'm also, by the way, I don't have to work just with MIT people. I'm very happy to work with other people, but that's just an interesting gap in the otherwise vast array of knowledge and expertise that we have on campus. So we're working with Michael Mina from the Harvard School of Public Health and Brigham and Women's Hospital, and also Galit Alter from the Reagan Institute, which is part of the MGH. It's affiliated with MIT, but it's really part of the Mass General Hospital family. And they have, I think, some remarkable ideas in terms of how to use and integrate serology testing, so these are blood tests for antibodies, into a broader testing package. And by the way, testing technology is, I think you know this, it's moving very rapidly and improving. But viral tests only give you a snapshot of who's infected at any particular moment. With serology, we can infer a lot of things carefully. Yes, I understand that there are appropriate reservations about exactly how to use serology right now as a diagnostic test. We are being very careful. But I also would point out that, and we can talk about this offline if you want, there's a lot of media reports about serology that are actually quite inaccurate. So these tests are better than commonly supposed right now. In any case, integrate serology with viral testing with a lot of other data that we're pulling together that addresses both the mobility of the pathogens and the mobility of people and the underlying economic and demographic characteristics of various populations. And what we're heading towards, I will tell you quite candidly, is an ability to build essentially weather forecasting for viruses. I think the historical analogy that appeals to me is the comparison with tornado forecasting. So in the 1920s and 1930s, the ability of anyone to forecast the arrival of tornadoes was basically non-existent. And you know this because you've all seen The Wizard of Oz, right? That's the primary assumption there. Tornadoes come out of nowhere. They're immensely destructive and terrifying. Well, in the 1940s and 50s, somewhat serendipitously, the US Air Force became involved. They got better data, models developed. The initial forecasts were not particularly convincing. But now I would suggest that any American, irrespective of their views of government or anything else, when they hear a tornado warning, or they're told a tornado is about to touch down, or a tornado is on the ground, is heading towards them, I think everyone I've ever met takes cover. And I think that's what we need for viruses, not just for Boston, Cambridge, Massachusetts, or just for the United States. I think you need that globally. I think we have just been taught a lesson by humanity's most powerful ever enemy, that if we don't prepare on a global basis with all the science and technology currently at our command, then this or something like this or something worse than this could absolutely happen again. The second wave, the third wave, the next mutation, who knows, right? But I would also say, and I'll end on this point, Lauren, and then we can do the Q&A. And so you can start to put your questions in the Q&A, and Lauren will field them for me and put them to me. And I'll also get to the questions that were asked when you registered. I would say that just like in World War II, Vannevar Bush, who was a former dean of engineering at MIT and a senior scientific leader in Washington at the Carnegie Institution, rallied his colleagues and persuaded the government to support a big effort to apply scientific knowledge to what needed to be done in 1940, 1941, and so on, which led to the, not the invention of radar, but the further accelerated remarkable development of radar at MIT, and of course the invention of the atomic bomb and many other pieces and types of technology. But in 1945, Bush wrote a report, again with the help of all his friends, called Science, the Endless Frontier, and in which he argued that World War II had used existing scientific knowledge, but if we wanted to stay safe and help people and improve health, actually health was is point number one in Bush's report. If you wanted to help yourselves, ourselves as Americans, but also help the world, you needed to invest more in science and technology. And John Gruber and I wrote a book last year called Jumpstarting America, in which we made that same argument and said this would be a good way to generate more well-paying jobs in the United States. It was well received, but a number of people said to us, well, look, guys, this will surely increase productivity growth and we'll get some more jobs. But remember, we're close to full employment, so it doesn't feel so pressing a year ago. Well, nobody's saying that to us now. In fact, there's bipartisan legislation that's now being proposed in Congress called, I think they're calling it the Endless Frontiers Act, right? Which is about not just putting money into science and technology, being strategic about where you deploy that around the country to generate more opportunity for more people and to encourage commercialization. Because you know, I mean, precisely, you are the people who know this better than anyone else in the world, I would suggest. It's the link between the research, the basic science, the more applied research, and the commercialization, public-private partnership with the universities in the center of it. That has been the center of so much positive development over the past 70 years. You know, I think we still have it. We haven't lost it, but we've forgotten just how important it was and has been and can be. And I think what we need to do now, not only around the weather forecasting for virus ideas, but the general proposition is, let's put a lot more money into resilience. What is resilience? It's the science of resilience. It's the technology of resilience. It's the companies that produce the products, including for-profit companies that produce diagnostics or anything else that will help safeguard resilience. But last point, Lauren, and then I'll turn to you. It's not investing to make money, investing for profit. It's investing for resilience and for social impact, which will include appropriate levels of profit and return on capital as needed to bring the right kind of investors into the mix. And we can do that. We can design that. I just laid out for you a very simple framework for public policy and for a partnership between federal, state, local government, universities, and universities will be very important in this, and all parts of the private sector, including investors, including entrepreneurs. So I'll come back and say a few more things about that towards the end, but I think that we can and should and will build this to get us through the second wave. There's a bit of a rush on for that, but also more broadly going forward. So Lauren, let me turn to you and you put the questions to me.
Great, Simon, thank you so much. You ended just there by talking about coordination between varying levels of government and private and public sectors. We have a question that came in that asked, how do we get to the point of global coordination, so not just within sectors within the US, in the current political environment of seemingly increasing nationalism?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we had a question in advance about how do you provide any vaccine that's developed on a global basis in a fair manner, which I think that's a good specific version of the same general question. You know, I think this is very difficult to answer completely under the current circumstances. I am convinced that the private sector, where I mean private sector means universities like MIT, it means faculty like myself, it means people we work with, some of whom are more for-profit and some of whom are less for-profit. I think we can have a big impact on building a better global health system. And there's obviously been many efforts by prominent people, including most notably the Gates Foundation, but also Bloomberg Health, which have done remarkable things in the United States and around the world. It's interesting that a sort of a pathogen forecasting and responsibility or ability to respond has not been built by those people. And, there's an interesting backstory there, but it hasn't existed to this point and it's not being pursued by them currently. I hope we can change that. I hope we can change that agenda. And I do think one thing we've learned quite clearly over the past 2 months is that, advocacy through action, where for Massachusetts Senior Care, we built a pilot surveillance study to show the value of testing in a nursing home context and to show how you could actually make the logistics work despite the craziness of the craziest days of the pandemic. We made that work and it saved lives. And I think when you show that to people in the policy world, and let's say when you show it to people who write editorials at the Boston Globe, then you get onto a path where the context for policy and discussion changes. Exactly what the global picture will look like, of course, I don't know. And nobody knows that. Depends on the outcomes of, various elections in various places and so on. But I do think the private sector can do a lot of this. And I do think seeing this as a global health imperative is an important first step.
Simon, you spoke earlier about the global supply chain with the N95 mask situation and how challenging that is. We had a question come in earlier asking, what do you think is the likelihood of the supply chain becoming much more domestically focused? And what do you think the implications would be increasing the role of manufacturing in the US and potentially global economy?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it's right on target. I will be very surprised if going forward, a country like the United States is comfortable with running critical, say, resilience-related supply chains across international borders. I mean, in some sense, we got lucky that China's pandemic or intense pandemic phase ended when it did, because that meant they were willing and able to to sell us personal protective equipment, including N95 masks. If their extremely dangerous phase of the pandemic could continue, I don't think those masks and other things would have been available to us. So why would a country like the United States, with a large population and a lot of talented people, why would we want to buy or rely on someone else being in good enough shape at the right moment to supply us with things that are absolutely essential to for our own survival? I mean, I think the answer to that is we won't once we get out of this. And so that means supply chains will change, and we'll be discussing exactly which parts of what supply chains need to be brought back on shore. And, the good news is that means more manufacturing and more manufacturing jobs. But I would emphasize that everything we know about manufacturing over recent decades suggests that there'll be more and more automation. So even though manufacturing output would presumably consequently increase, it may not generate anywhere near as many jobs as we had previously, which leads me to the agenda that John Gruber and I laid out in Jumpstarting America, because that was exactly designed to generate more good jobs, more well-paying jobs as part of the bigger scientific endeavor and the infrastructure you build to expand science and so on. So I think, Lauren, that this onshoring of supply chains can be handled in a way that's positive, a way that's consistent for economic growth, a way that doesn't disrupt the global economy. But it needs to be complemented by broader other investments led by the federal government, but definitely involving the private sector, that will create the much needed jobs.
Speaking of creation of jobs, we have a question asking, with fiscal and monetary stimulus coming in, is there any hope for keeping inflation in check over the mid to long term?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. And obviously, my background at the IMF, among other things, makes me very cautious in thinking about inflation risks. Of course, we were concerned, I was concerned after the last crisis, the global financial crisis, that some of the measures that were being taken, including monetary, particularly the various phases of quantitative easing, which was then, as you remember, very much in the news, I was concerned there might be unintended consequences on the inflation front. I think the people who ran the Fed were actually right, and I was wrong in that instance, because their view was, as long as you have so much what they call slack in the economy, you can call it mass unemployment, that takes the pressure off wages. And as long as that pressure is off wages, you're not going to get into some sort of inflation spiral. So some prices may go up. We can certainly argue about whether asset prices were in any sense too high or elevated, and whether that was somewhat distortionary. That's an interesting conversation. But we didn't get inflation, long-term inflation expectations didn't move. So, I don't really care for central bank language, having had to use it for too much of my life. But they had this phrase where they say that they will remain vigilant, which means they're not actually going to do anything, but they will pay attention. And I do think that vigilance on inflation might actually be the right term here, because I'm not sure that I would want to raise interest rates or cut back on fiscal policy under these circumstances. And if I'm not willing to make those decisions, then that means that I'm not very worried about inflation. I mean, those things go closely together, if not hand in hand. So glad you're asking the question. Keep asking the question. Ask it every week if you want. But until we see inflation, and really not just relative prices moving, obviously, but sustained increase in the price level, then I think we will continue to have, by historical standards, very easy monetary policy and, quite remarkable fiscal policy, which I support. I mean, I think we're in a survival phase. The goal of this phase, the measurable objective, is to get as many people through to the other side of the chasm with as little damage as possible. And we're lucky in this country that we have, some significant but not unlimited amount of fiscal capacity to do that. In many other countries around the world, they don't have that. And I'm very worried about what's going to happen there in economic and social and political terms.
That's a great way to go into the next question, which is the idea of investing for resilience. So getting people from one side of the chasm to the other. So we're investing for resilience, not profit, which you mentioned before. Please expand on this idea about how society can marshal this and how individuals can participate at different levels. And is there other further reading that they could do?
Yeah, well, we'll send around some of our policy papers and one-pagers and slide decks and so on in the days and weeks ahead. If you're interested, very happy to share those. I think that one could imagine, this is not what's going to happen, but you could imagine that, the state of Massachusetts would take the lead, that its Department of Public Health would expand its state laboratory, that they would partner in a smooth and effortless way with Harvard, various parts of MIT, and you could build a really strong virus weather forecasting capacity on the basis of that sort of public sector works with deep-pocketed private institutions, the universities, and produces something amazing for the world. That's not going to happen, right? I mean, I'm fully aware of the world we live in, and I talk to the relevant principles. I do think that we can construct something in that space using the fact that the state needs a better monitoring capacity. And a lot of private companies would like to test their workers, by the way. And testing, I think people are increasingly realizing when you talk to chief medical officers, they realize that testing means virus testing, but also serology, the antibody testing, gives you a deeper, a richer picture of who's been infected, when, and how. And that lets you understand not just relative immunity, which can be useful, actionable information, but also how exposed you are, right? So if the general view, okay, and I understand, the data are extremely sketchy on this, but the general view is that the average seroprevalence, so presence of antibodies for COVID-19 in the blood of residents of the United States, is probably around 3 to 5%. But there are some parts of the country, maybe New York City would be New York City is the most salient example, where that seroprevalence might be 30%. And that leads to some very interesting thoughts. For example, on the side of nursing homes, and here I'm speaking entirely for myself, and this is only, this is work in progress, let's say. But I'm thinking of a particular nursing home. This is a real one, not a hypothetical one, sadly, that had 40% deaths in the first wave. Now that creates a lot of empty beds, and that those beds will now be filled by people coming in from the general population who are mostly susceptible to the disease. Now, because we can't protect nursing homes fully, even despite our best efforts, question is, how should you group people in that nursing home? Should you keep the susceptible people away from everyone who's had COVID-19, or mix them together in such a way as you create a sort of, this is what the epidemiologists call ring vaccination, although you do it with vaccination. In this case, you're doing it with naturally occurring antibodies. So you're mixing people who've been exposed with people who are susceptible to try and slow down any outbreak when it comes into the facility, and therefore have more time to bring in additional PPE or infection control resources or anything else that will help. So I think that, what I just described there is a public health situation, problem to be solved. The state has a huge interest in getting this right. The state, I don't think the state is going to lead on this, but they can be in the leadership group, maybe. And then the question is, who else can be in there, and how do we combine private sector efforts, which are, for the large companies doing it for themselves, for their workers, and for their customers? How do we get that on a convergent path with what the public sector needs and what public health, the demands of public health? It's not a trivial problem, but I do believe it's a problem that can be solved with the right people at the table. So we're working on it, and I'm happy to share updates as we go.
Thank you, Simon. Simon, we have a couple questions about the possible or definite second wave. What will a second wave look like in your opinion, and which countries are more or less likely to be impacted by this?
Well, look, I think it's very important that we be extremely candid with each other about the limits of our knowledge. I think there were some mistakes made, or maybe that's too strong, but there were some moments in the first wave where certain experts appeared to convey that they were great, they were confident in certain estimates and forecasts, where if you look carefully at the work on which it was based, they should have been much more circumspect. And so this is me being extremely circumspect with you. I think the second wave could take a number of forms. One is obviously some forms of reopening, particularly if people aren't careful. That may be a risk factor. To the extent that you're outside interacting with people, the risk of infection is, as far as we know, substantially less. So in the warm weather in North America, you would ordinarily expect much less transmission of any virus or coronavirus. So we're reopening, but the weather is better and we're outside more. So how is that going to play out? When schools go back, let's say in August in many parts of the country, that could well play a factor. In all other coronaviruses, children are an important vector of transmission, and they're frequently not symptomatic. So children family to child to family, that could be quite important. And we're working with some K through 12 school districts to try and think about how to get ahead of that. That I will flag that as a very difficult problem. I mean, just telling the kids to stay home, don't go to school is, I think, no kind of solution, because the school that they miss, particularly lower income children, they will not get back. That we know that's a permanent lifetime damage to their human capital and earnings and their ability to take care of themselves and their families. You don't want that. We also know that if they stay home, if all the kids stay home, lower income kids don't have access to the infrastructure, including bandwidth, but also teachers and materials who are able to keep that education going. So there's a very difficult balance of risk problems. I think that may be the biggest social problem coming at us in the fall. There are concerns that when you bring back college campuses, that will spread the infection. I am more convinced that the colleges with which I'm, let's say, most familiar, and it's not just MIT, but others, they are getting themselves organized. They're in a very, I find, creative and constructive phase. So I'm quite confident, and they have resources, right? So I'm quite confident that they will do things in a safer manner. And there'll be some infection, but I think it can be contained and controlled through various processes and let's say workflow reorganization that's being put in place. I think that the next and the last, if you like, moment, Lauren, is when the weather gets colder again. So flu is called seasonal flu for a reason, right? That's when we go indoors, and that's when we breathe on each other. We breathe the air around each other much more. So with good reason, some people are very worried about November, December, and some colleges are considering what to do about Thanksgiving and so on. I mean, we will know a lot more by then. We will have much better testing capacities. There'll be many more, I believe, rapid tests. And we're working to make sure all the data from these tests, even tests that you can do at home very, very simply, we want that data to be reported in an anonymous fashion, in a completely privacy-preserving fashion, so to the public health authorities, so that they can see where the disease is and where it's not. And they can make recommendations about, who should be wearing masks and what other kinds of preventive or evasive action is recommended for people. And I'm very big on the idea that in the next phase, we'll be doing a lot of recommending and not so much by the way of requiring. I think the compliance issues around repeatedly requiring people to do things are going to be daunting. But if you explain to people what the problem is and you show them how to keep themselves safer, and you explain to them that if they don't do this, it's a risk to them, their families, their loved ones, their community, and the nursing homes, I'm actually quite optimistic that the compliance will be good and good enough. So those are the obvious moments, Lauren, for a potential second wave. In terms of the countries less likely to be impacted, well, I think that is a huge issue and not an easy one at all. If there are countries that acquire by the time of a second wave something like herd immunity, as I'm sure you all know, for a virus with this kind of infection is somewhere between 60 and 80% of everyone in the country having had the disease and therefore antibodies that mean that either they can't get reinfected, or if they get reinfected, it's nowhere near as they are nowhere near as contagious, like 5 or 6 orders of magnitude less contagious in terms of the viral particles that they shed. So who has what kind of herd immunity right now? We don't know. What we do know is all around the world, people, for self-preservation reasons, because there was a lot of fear, people backed off and stayed away from each other. And so that has slowed down the progress of the disease. And we will see, even in countries that haven't had and don't have the, let's say, state capacity to suppress the disease, how many people have still become infected? We don't know. And any country that doesn't have herd immunity, and by the way, to be clear, if you have herd immunity, people can still get infected in your country, but you won't have the generalized outbreak. And that's the intuition there. You can have localized outbreaks, so that's an important problem. You could still have a lot of people die in the nursing homes, don't forget that, but you're not going to have the same kind of general outbreak of the kind we experienced around the world in February, March, and April. So herd immunity is the key. We don't yet have the data. How would you get the data? Yes, you guessed it, serology. So when we have an ability to deploy very cheap dried blood spot cards around the world and to have people, you collect blood very cheaply, you can pop these cards in the mail. It's completely safe to do that. And you need to be processed by centralized labs in order to, partly get better quality results, but also to make sure that the data is reported in a consistent manner. Then we will have a picture, I would say, Lauren, of who's more vulnerable and who's less vulnerable. And that'll help people think a lot about what kind of movement of people and goods around the world is safe and where we should be more careful.
I appreciate you talking about educating people about why they need to wear a mask, why they need to stay home. I think having worked with MIT alumni and students for many, many years, I've always said it's not the decision, it's the explanation behind it. People want to understand why. And I think that's true far beyond MIT. Recognizing the demographic differences of how this disease is affecting different communities. You talked about low-income communities before. The racial demographics are pretty stark. How do you get that word out and ensure that everyone is educated at the same level?
Right. So yes, yeah, good point. Nicely drawn comparison there, Lauren. Look, with MIT students and MIT graduates, we're going to show them the math. Literally show them the math and show them the principles, show them what we know about the physics and the chemistry and the biology. And I think that will be persuasive. But obviously for many other people in the country, including some people in the policy world I know quite well, that is not going to be of interest. And they want the short, clear version that has been well vetted, that has been reviewed carefully, that's been kicked around by experts and in the public forum. So we're working on that. I think that the issue that follows subsequent to that, Lauren, or perhaps concurrently with that, is adoption. Right. So so let's say we do have a better approach and some good ideas about what masks should be worn, when, how, and so on. And let's say we can make that seasonal, because I don't actually believe that you could have K through 12 kids or many other people in this country wear well-fitting cotton masks 24/7 every day of the year. I really don't. That's too much to ask. They're not going to do that. But if you can say to people, when you open up your phone in the morning to check the headlines, it says danger, risk of pathogens or COVID-19 or whatever in your area or even in your micro area is today high. Well, that's like air quality alerts. Don't go outside if you're vulnerable, right? And I think converting it into sort of message, that's an advisory. I don't think you get arrested for going outside when it's a code red pollution day. Not in any jurisdiction I'm familiar with. And I think that that creates great scope, Lauren, I would say, for bringing in experts like Duncan Semester, who you're reminding me I need to go talk to Duncan about this exact question, because Duncan is very experienced and has a lot of insights into how to get people to adopt particular technologies or products. And I think we could apply that here exactly, which is you experiment with messages, you try different ways of presenting it to people. And then this kind of testing is obviously much easier if we do things over the internet and do things digitally, which surely we would. And then you can see who's adopting the right approach based on which messages, and you can adjust your messages to reflect that. Wouldn't it be great, Lauren, if we use some of this technology that's used by, let's say, large companies that attempt to, change your opinion and bring you closer to certain products. Wouldn't it be great if we could use that exact same technology to make Americans and the world safer?
I agree, that would be great.
So we'll
I appreciate you working on it. I'm glad you linked back to, you were talking about weather forecasting for viruses, which sounds true from the scientific standpoint, thinking about the second wave and where this is going, but it's interesting that you linked education back to the way we watch the weather. So it could be, if it needs to be that universal in order to have the adoption rates that matter.
So tornado forecasts were not taken seriously, Lauren, by people for quite a long time because they had too many false positives and too many false negatives. Mm-hmm. And I think that's not unreasonable. I mean, you do have to show people, you've got to put forecasts out there. The forecasts have to be sufficiently good. And whenever a weather forecast is wrong, everyone's like, what happened there? And there better be some good explanation. There better be some public debate and enough transparency around that. I think almost all, if not absolutely all, weather forecasts in the United States are based on data that's collected by the government and made publicly available through an open source type structure. So building companies and products and information systems and recommendation engines on top of public data is something we're very comfortable with in the weather space. And I think what we're proposing in the public health space is exactly analogous. Let's build an industry, but at the base of that industry, there needs to be well-vetted, appropriately collected and distributed data that is available to everyone subject to appropriate terms and conditions.
Absolutely. There is a question about vaccines, that elusive vaccine that we're all hoping for soon, that touches on the demographic differences and kind of needing to provide universal information and care here. So flu vaccines are provided either for free or at a very low cost. What do you think the cost of a COVID vaccine or treatment should be once it's developed, and how is it distributed widely?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and there's going to be a lot of discussion about that. I'm fully in support of people earning a decent return on capital. I think that's important, and I fully understand there are risks in vaccine development. So there's many companies taking those risks right now. That's appropriate. I mean, we should also recognize there's a lot of public money goes into the basic science and now some of the more applied vaccine development strategies out there. I note that Johnson & Johnson has said that they're going to pursue their vaccine primarily as a form of corporate social responsibility. So they want a return on capital, but they're not looking to make an enormous profit. I think that's a very compelling message, and I think other people will be looking at that and considering the implications. You do need this vaccine to be available to as many people as possible, and as many people who want to be vaccinated. And that's going to be an interesting discussion. And you want it to be available around the world as quickly as possible. So the scale up of manufacturing is going to be costly. Many countries don't pay a lot for medicines and refuse to pay a lot or can't pay a lot for medicines. So that's going to be a very interesting and tricky and delicate discussion. I did see a related question, which was, does the country in which the vaccine is developed matter? But that one came in advance, Lauren. I think the answer is yes, of course it does. I mean, let's be realistic. But it's also in the interest of, for example, the United States to ensure that other people in other countries around the world have access to the vaccine, because it is the pathogen is not particularly stopping at borders, not when there's flow of passengers and cargo around the world of the kind that we had before the pandemic. So I think that it is going to be a hotly contested topic. Our view is that while the vaccine is a limited, scarce resource, so that there's a certain number of doses of vaccine that are going to be available a year from now on a daily or weekly basis. The data approach and the weather forecasting approach is much more scalable. So that once you have, there's some cost, which is the dried blood spot cards, and building the lab capacity, but it's actually remarkably cheap. I mean, certainly compared to developing vaccines. So this is something that could be available at scale everywhere in the world a year from now, if we get the right people at the table and we really push it hard. So that, I think, is an interesting complement. And of course, one thing that will help you do is when you think about vaccine, one of the questions is going to be so one question will be who wants the vaccine, right? Another question will be who needs the vaccine. Where do we have concentrations of susceptible people who are extremely vulnerable and will die if they're not vaccinated? I would start with them personally. Now, some of them are in nursing homes, assisted living. Some of them live in the community. You have to be very careful with the safety trials aspect when you're vaccinating vulnerable people. I just say that. I need to say that out loud. But I think around the world, that's also going to be an issue, Lauren, which is that there will be, obviously vulnerable people who are obviously likely to die soon unless the vaccine reaches them. And I think that their claim on this vaccine will be, to me, highly legitimate and important to take into consideration.
That's a really interesting way of framing it. Thank you. Simon, I'm going to ask you one more question because I remember you saying you wanted to end on a positive note, so I want to leave you a few minutes to be able to do that.
Right.
Why is the United States so slow to add temperature testing, which is admittedly imperfect, to airports, manufacturing plants, et cetera? And why don't we use this and UV radiation in concert to reducing going forward risks?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think honestly, the answer is we were taken by surprise by the vaccine and not by the vaccine, by the virus. And our existing technological capacities, which are enormous, right, were not applied quickly at the beginning. And then everything became really confused. And the amount of misinformation out there and the number of really fundamental things that are not understood by all kinds of people in political leadership or media or whatever is just remarkable. It's actually something that I've seen many times before, because in large economic and financial crises, people start believing all kinds of madness, and they stop believing that the laws of economics or physics or anything else apply. It's like, oh my goodness, the world has changed. Everything is, there's no limits on what could happen. And it's like a freak out. I mean, it's not exactly a technical term, but that's what it is. COVID craziness is what one of my colleagues calls it. I think that's a good term for it in this case. And I think that what COVID craziness does, Lauren, is it generates like 1,000 emails every day to each other saying, what about this idea? What about that idea? The policymakers and foundations and other people we deal with are just inundated with good proposals, can't sort them out. And you know, I think if we sat down calmly and looked at either what makes sense or what those South Koreans are doing, because South Korea, as many of you may know, has continued to operate almost, I mean, with some interruptions and some selective lockdowns, but they've had a fair amount of disease, and they're pursuing it aggressively through contact tracing and testing and isolation. But they have a lot of relevant guidance that they provide to workplaces, and a lot of technologies are being applied appropriately. And there's certainly a large employers there that I'm familiar with that are screening the temperature of every employee when they come in every day, which they think misses about 50% of the cases. So let's be clear, it's a you need a layered approach, and one of the layers would include temperature screening, and it does catch some people, so that's good. I think we need other layers. There's a technology being developed at MIT in Eric Alm's lab. The commercial version is called BioBot. You can look that up. It's a COVID-19 sniffing technology for wastewater, and they have a capacity to track COVID-19 at Deer Island, which is wastewater treatment for about 2.5 million people living in the greater Boston area. And they have a very interesting data series measuring, you know, what happened before the epidemic, which is zero COVID-19, and then the way in which it grew and the way in which it's come down, but not come down fully since we had the 2-month lockdown. So I think, Lauren, there's a whole suite of technologies that are already available that can be deployed, some scale up, but not even a lot of scale up. And then we need to do that, and we need to do that for ourselves and for our companies and for our universities and other places. And then we need to figure out how to build a public health strategy around those. And then we need to build and develop more technology. So that's where the serology idea comes in. And then we need to do more basic science and push forward. And this is my little closing inspirational piece, Lawrence. So maybe I'll transition to that, which is, as I already mentioned, the book with John Gruber, which looked at the history of science and innovation in the United States, and asked the question, what went right in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, and what is it that we have sort of lost from that moment? And public support, federal government support for research and development in the mid-1960s peaked at about 2% of GDP, which is a remarkably high number. And now it runs between 0.6 and 0.7% of GDP. And I think the general view is not as much goes into productive basic science and commercialization and so on. So we generated massive industries from those investments, including most of modern pharmaceuticals, including the computer industry. This is back in the day, aeronautics, airspace, airplanes, and space. That all came from these big public investments, you know, GPS, the internet. I think you know those stories. What have we done lately along the same big strategic lines? Well, Human Genome Project, thank goodness, right? Because that generated, you know, it was some, initially millions of dollars the private sector didn't want to invest because they said, you know, investors said, look, this is general knowledge, not super interesting from a commercial point of view. Government put in about $10 billion. And out of that came an industry that employed, or employees roughly, close to 300,000 people with well-paying jobs, and an ability to redeploy resources, it turns out, which is what we see at the Broad Institute, from the genomics research into PCR testing in just a remarkable triumph of technological capacity and ability and I'd say management ability at the Broad as well. So having more of that, I would say, is of critical importance. And that was the argument John and I were making, which is let's go big. Let's make a big push on science and technology. Let's spread those opportunities around the country because there's many parts of the United States that need that kind of and would benefit from and be really great for that kind of opportunity. And let's focus on making sure that science, which, full disclosure, we did not emphasize pandemic resilience a year ago, didn't see that one coming like everyone else. And that's why it's a crisis, right? But pandemic resilience across all branches of science is exactly what we're scrambling to mobilize right now. And that's what's going to define and lay out a need for this systematic investment, supported by the federal government, with universities heavily involved, with the private sector snapping up ideas and trying to develop them, and with an appropriate degree of for-profit activity in that space. And we can argue, long and hard about what appropriate degree means, but I'm a professor of entrepreneurship, as you all know, and I'm a big believer that private enterprise can add a tremendous amount to the life of the country and to the lives of individuals, including saving lives. I just think we need to have a balance, and we need to have an appropriate sustainable funding mechanism and an appropriate set of politics around this. So it's not, all the opportunities and all the returns in the hands of a few people. It's much more broadly spread out, which is what we did in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. So this is not a massive egalitarian agenda. It's a massive entrepreneurial agenda, an entrepreneurship agenda, which has positive implications, I would say, for generating opportunities across a broad swath of Americans. And I think to the extent that we can develop technology that we sell to the world, we'll give some of it away, but I think we'll also sell some of it. That's good for the world. I mean, 330 million people, Americans, the most innovative country in the history of the world, in a world of 7 billion on its way to, well, we'll see, right? 10 billion, 12 billion, if I believe John Sturman's forecast, or the UN forecast John Sturman talks about. That's a place that's going to have a lot of problems. I mean, climate change, pathogens, food supply, all kinds of issues that we can group under the heading, I think, now of resilience. So let's invest now. Let's be the people who lead the world on developing the science and technology that makes that possible. And I think there's increasing degree of bipartisan agreement on that. Yes, the public finances of the country are hard pressed, but I'm talking about amazingly productive and high return from a social point of view investments in the context of historically low and likely low for a long time interest rates. So that's a pretty compelling proposition, I would suggest. And that's certainly something that John Gruber and I and others continue to press hard in Washington. And we'll send you updates on that if you're interested, because it matters for MIT. It matters for a lot of the businesses where you work. And I think we are, making progress despite the COVID craziness. I think we will get, you never get to exactly what you want in the policy world, but you can move in the right direction. You can help people change their minds. And I'm encouraged, I have to say, by what I'm hearing from both Republicans and Democrats, not all of them, of course, but increasingly from both sides of the aisle on this issue.
Simon, before we started today, we talked about how you are working harder than ever, and it's very obvious that that's true. So I just want to say thank you for joining us today, and thank you for being at the forefront of this really important work and leading the world in this. We greatly appreciate you and your colleagues. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Lauren. Thanks for the opportunity, and good luck, everyone. And I hope you have a good day and plenty of other fun interactions with MIT today and this weekend and going forward. Stay in touch.
Absolutely. And we just want to say a special thank you to all of our attendees today for your Dean Circle support this year. Again, we greatly appreciate that. And those of you who've contributed jobs and internships and mentorship support to current Sloan students. We hope you enjoyed virtual Sloan reunions this year. This is the final program for that. But if you are looking for more information from MIT, we encourage you to join virtual tech reunions, which you had in the email, and we would love to see you online. And if you missed any programming this week, we will send out recordings in the coming weeks. Thank you again, Simon, and have a great weekend, everyone.